Okay, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest. We're going to discuss what is phenomenology, and we're going to also talk about the brilliant German philosopher Edmund Husserl. And today I have Dr. Dermot Moran from Boston College who's going to guide us, maybe navigate us through Husserl's life and phenomenology. So first and foremost, thank you very much for being here today, Dr. Moran, and
Thank
I'm
you.
very excited to have you a part of this series.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to look forward to this.
So Dr. Dermot Moran is a professor from Boston College, is the inaugural holder of the Joseph Chair in Catholic Philosophy. He was previously professor of philosophy, logic, and metaphysics at the University College Dublin. He is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and Institut International de Philosophie. His publications include The Introduction to Phenomenology in 2000, Edmund Husserl, founder of Phenomenology, 2005, and Husserl's Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology in 2012, and co-authored with Joseph Cohen, Husserl's Dictionary in 2012, as well as edited works, Husserl's Logical Investigations, Volume 2, Routledge 2001, and the shorter Logical Investigations, The Phenomenology Reader, co-edited with Tim Mooney, Routledge 2002, as well as the Phenomenology, Critical Concepts in Philosophy, 5 volumes co-edited with Lester E. Embry, Routledge 2004, and the Routledge Companion to 20th Century Philosophy, Routledge 2008. Dr. Moran is also was the president of the World Congress in 2018 and past president of the World Congress in Rome in 2024. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Moran. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Chris.
So perhaps we can start off with the question, who was Edmund Husserl? And maybe we could also go into a little biography on his life. Maybe not too exhaustive, just maybe the main events.
Okay, Chris, that's great. Yeah, look, first of all, Husserl is basically regarded, indeed, as the title of one of my books, as the founder of phenomenology. And phenomenology was the word that was around already in Kant and Hegel, usually something to do with the science of appearances. But in Husserl, it became the radical basis for a new science underpinning all cognition and all other sciences. So it became the science of sciences, as it were, in Edmund Husserl. And Edmund Husserl inaugurated this vision of phenomenology in 1900 in his logical investigations. So you could say that the 20th century began with at least 2 new sciences, psychoanalysis, which was inaugurated by Sigmund Freud in his interpretation of dreams, 1899, and Husserl's logical investigations, 1900, 1901, that inaugurated the new science of phenomenology. And what Freud and Husserl have in common is that they were both students of Franz Brentano. And Franz Brentano was a late 19th century philosopher. He was originally a Catholic priest, but he left the priesthood, who is known internationally as one of the founders of empirical psychology. He, along with Wilhelm Wundt, and later William James, they're regarded as the real inaugurators at the late 19th century of the science of psychology. So I'll have more to say about that in a little bit. But Brentano was Edmund Husserl's mentor, and he was also, a little bit earlier, Freud had attended his classes. So what Brentano sought to do in a book that he wrote called Psychology from the Empirical Standpoint was to set psychology on a new basis. He felt that no real advancement had been made since Aristotle's De Anima or Descartes' study of the mind, or Hume's study of the mind. And so Brentano wanted a new grounding to the science of psychology, but he also thought that psychology had to underpin all the other human sciences. For example, not just politics or law, but almost history, everything where we have to figure out what human beings are doing, what's their motivations. We need psychology. So, and it was that vision that the underlying science of sciences was psychology as the science of the human mind, that inspired Husserl to move it further and develop what he called phenomenology. And he thought phenomenology was a more reliable term than psychology. So that's the basis of where they started. But let me give you a brief introduction to Husserl's life. Husserl was born in Moravia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he studied locally and also in Vienna before going to university in Leipzig and then Berlin. But he was originally interested in mathematics, and so he studied with some of the prominent mathematicians of his day, and his PhD thesis was on mathematics. He studied with a mathematician called Weierstrass. And then he began to query the foundations of mathematics, and especially the natural numbers. I mean, how is it that we're able to perceive numbers? I can look out in my garden, I can see 5 birds, or I can see 6 trees. And, how do we understand and grasp these numbers that are not exactly qualities of things like their colors, but somehow are some sets of objects that we are able to group? Like behind me, there's a group of books, but I can't tell you what exact number, but I can tell you there is a number of books, and that's a precise number as well. So Husserl wanted to figure out what was the foundations of our knowledge of numbers, and that led him to Brentano, because he thought there would be a psychological foundation to our perception of number. And that was the basis of Husserl's first book, The Philosophy of Arithmetic, which was an attempt to apply Brentanian descriptive psychology to the analysis of number. And very quickly, Husserl realized, as did Bertrand Russell and Whitehead, that counting and number may be a psychological operation, but actually mathematics depends on many, many logical operations, negation, multiplication, all of these things that are rather like logical operators. And so Husserl realized that he needed to go further in his analysis of mathematics than psychology, and that he needed to understand the basic operations of logic. And that led to his logical investigations of 1900-1901. And that led him to propose that he needed a new science to study logic and the cognitive operations that are involved in all forms of knowledge. And he chose for that a term he found actually in Brentano, phenomenology. So that's how he founded phenomenology and the logical investigations. So he went on as a professor in Göttingen and then in Freiburg to literally to develop and draw students around him into a large phenomenological movement. Husserl was really a scientist. He was self-educated in philosophy. So he thought that the best way to do philosophy was to do it like scientists do, by having a team. So he attracted all of these other people. And in 1913, he set up what is called the Yearbook for Phenomenology. And that yearbook published volumes for about 11, 12 years. But the volumes included Shaler's basic works, Heidegger's Being and Time, the works of Edith Stein, and others. So Husserl gathered around him and became the leader of the phenomenological movement, including his protege Heidegger. So then Husserl retired from Freiburg in 1928, and he was replaced by Heidegger in the chair. And their relations soured a little bit because Heidegger wanted to take phenomenology in a radically different direction. And when Husserl finally sat down to read Being and Time, he realized that Heidegger's analysis of Dasein, of human existence, was very different to his own account of human subjectivity and consciousness. And there was a sort of set parting of the ways between Husserl and Heidegger. But Heidegger's star was on the ascent after Husserl had retired. But what really poisoned the well was that Heidegger attached himself to the Nazi movement in 1933. Heidegger became the rector of Freiburg University, and indeed it was while he was rector, he was only rector for 9 months in 1933, but they were the fateful months where one of his jobs was to apply the Nazi prohibition on anyone of Jewish background being in public education or even being in a civil service position. So Husserl was already emeritus, but he lost his emeritus status. He lost even his library card. He couldn't go to the library. Eventually, one after another humiliation was imposed on him using the Nazi laws. You know, they eventually they took away his apartment. They gave him a smaller one, but he wasn't allowed as a Jew to own this larger apartment. He had to wear the yellow star, and he spent his last years really in isolation as a Jew in Freiburg. Now, some of his students tried to arrange for him to escape to America, and his own son went to America, but Husserl said he was too old. He died in 1938, so he didn't experience the horrors of the camp. But had he lived, he would have. And his student Edith Stein died in Auschwitz, and others of his students had to flee, mainly to America. So a lot of the new school for phenomenology, the phenomenologists of the new school went because they were Jewish. You know, so that's the background. So his life was in turmoil once the Nazis came to power. And then so his works were sort of they couldn't be published in Germany and all the rest of that. And gradually, Husserlian phenomenology was replaced in the sort of world stage by Heideggerian phenomenology. But then, you know, he had a revival with Merleau-Ponty, who really took his work seriously and went on from there. So I can say more about the development of phenomenology, but I just want to give you that insight. He lived through difficult times. One other fact that really not well damaged him psychologically, but he was a German, you know, even though he was Austro-Hungarian, he was a German speaker. He was a very proud, as he described himself, a Bismarckian nationalist of the old German variety. He was very proud that his children served in the First World War, and one of his sons was killed in 1916 at Verdun, and that really affected him personally very deeply. So, you know, he was really, really shocked to be told he wasn't German, that he was not an Aryan and there's lots of letters for him expressing his outrage that he has been treated so bad, considering his family had actually participated in the First World War and had supported the German nationalist aims and so on. So it's a kind of sad story. He, by the way, sorry, one other thing. He was Jewish and his wife was Jewish, but he voluntarily converted to Christianity. This is in 1917. And he was not a church-going, but a Bible reading Christian all his life. And he was one of, and many of his students converted to religion or to Christianity. Shaler became a Catholic at one point. Reinach was also a Jew who became a Christian, and Edith Stein was a Jew who became a Catholic. So Husserl remarked on this transformative character of phenomenology as he saw it.
Well, I think you did a wonderful job of introducing who Husserl was and going through his very tumultuous life. You had brought up Brentano, and I was just wondering maybe we could talk just a little bit about Husserl's influences. Who were some of
Yes.
the influences that come out in his phenomenology?
Yeah, and of course, relating to German idealism, that's very important. As I mentioned, Husserl, he took some philosophy classes at Berlin, but he was primarily interested in taking the work of the sort of psychologists of the time. Um, so Stumpf, who was a student of Brentano, was one of his mentors. and he was a psychologist. He wrote on the perception of sound, tone psychology. But it was really, Husserl really only turned in a philosophical direction when he was trying to question the origins of mathematics, and he moved to Brentano. And then so primarily he observed Brentano's view of philosophy. And Brentano is known to us as the founder of psychology, empirical psychology. But Brentano was also one of the founders of the Catholic neo-Thomist movement. And that neo-Thomist movement placed a great deal of emphasis on the importance of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. And as I mentioned already, Brentano was a huge admirer of Aristotle's De Anima as a great psychological text. So, but Brentano was a very big admirer also of the British empiricists. And indeed, the title, Psychology from the Empirical Standpoint, is a nod to Hume, especially, and Mill, because Brentano was a great admirer of this empirical, non-speculative approach to the mind that he found in Mill, the analysis of our connections that we make through causation and so on. So Brentano was quite hostile to German idealism, especially what he regarded as the speculative, he used the word Schwärmerei, which is kind of nonsense of Hegel. So Brentano was extremely anti-Hegelian. He was also anti-Kantian. He really went back to Hume, who he thought was reviving Aristotle in describing the processes of the mind. And Brentano had these amazing students. I mentioned Freud and Husserl, and Meinong was another one who took this psychology in different directions. And Brentano, Husserl wrote a tribute to him, was an amazing and inspiring teacher who was much better in the lecture hall than in writing. A lot of his work remained unpublished at his death. But Husserl's initial worldview came from Brentano. But however, later, around 1905, he read Kant. And there is a talk of a sort of Kantian turn in Husserlian philosophy. And from about 1908, Husserl is starting to describe himself as an idealist. And indeed, he uses the term transcendental idealism already around 1911, 1913. And then he has this big book, Ideas, in 1913, that most people see as a foundational text in the transcendental phenomenology. So you can say that Husserl moved from the descriptive psychology of Brentano, which he renamed descriptive phenomenology, then to transcendental phenomenology. And that lasted all through the 20s. So even Husserl's Cartesian Meditations is an essay in transcendental phenomenology. And again, talking about his influences, Husserl was deeply influenced by Descartes because Brentano, like Hume, didn't really locate an ego at the center of our psychic life. He thought more like Hume of our stream of flux of consciousness and of the interrelation and interembeddedness between things like perception, memory, fantasy, time consciousness. And Husserl wrote on all of these. But then Husserl more and more realized that you need a core to consciousness. And he thought that Descartes' cogito ergo sum and the self-reflective nature of the cogito, that gave him that core. So Husserl's often talked about philosophy as a kind of egology, phenomenology as a science of the ego, egology. He uses that phrase in the Cartesian Meditations and elsewhere. So one of the things that Husserl does in his radical reading of the history of philosophy is to say it's not Kant who was the first transcendental philosopher, but Descartes. So the turn away from the world to the self, to the ego, and the ego as a constituting source of all our experience, that's what Husserl gets from Descartes. And that's why Husserl wrote the Cartesian Meditations. And one other thing I'll just say, because this will help us to understand the more mature Husserl later on, Husserl was often accused of being a kind of egoistic solipsist, that and many of the earlier criticisms of phenomenology saw it as a continuation of the so-called psychological introspectionism, where one did psychology by examining one's own experiences. So you look inside yourself and try to see how your mind is sort of structured. And most modern experimental psychology went away from that. Of course, behaviorism was a huge reaction against introspectionism. But Husserl's never was purely focused on that. Indeed, that's why we'll talk about them. These reductions come into play. It's to bracket our naive and naturalistic assumptions about our cognitive processes. But Husserl at the same time, or see, more or less the same time as he moved in the transcendental direction, also studied empathy as a way of connecting us to other people. He got that through the psychologist Lipps, Theodor Lipps in Munich, who was one of the great psychologists studying empathy. But Husserl wrote a lot on empathy and the connection to other people as a basis for what he called intersubjectivity. And then in his late work, he realized we can't understand the social and the communal without understanding the context of these life worlds that we all are embedded in. And Husserl's late work was all about the nature of the life world. And indeed, Husserl has a version of human nature as being in the world, which is very similar to what Heidegger, that term itself is Heidegger's term, but it's all over Husserl. The idea that human beings are egoic beings, but they are egoic beings in an intersubjective harmony, and Husserl often takes the term from Leibniz, the harmony of monads, or he even uses the term monadology. So Husserl's influences were Brentano's conception of philosophy, and then, as I mentioned, Hume, and then Descartes and Leibniz, and later Kant, but never really Hegel. I do not think there's any evidence that Husserl read Hegel, although the late Husserl, in talking about the life world, is clearly thinking about our social and historical developmental concept of culture and spirit. And Husserl does speak a lot of the phenomenology of spirit in his late works, but without any direct reference to, for example, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit.
Well, thank you very much for that very wonderful and robust answer. You brought up phenomenology multiple times, so maybe we could now move to what was phenomenology for Husserl? Is it a method? Is it a mode of philosophy?
Yes, both actually. I think he initially conceived it as a method for analyzing first mathematics and then our logical experiences. And then he kind of broadened it out to think that all cognition required to be clear. The conceptual basis of cognition and its fundamental operations needed to be clarified. And so he uses the word clarification, clairung, many times to say that phenomenology is to provide this clarification. How is it supposed to do the clarification? By showing how these processes and features of conscious life are located and rooted in subjectivity. So there's you can say, and Husserl says in his own life work later on, that the essence of phenomenology is what he calls the correlation between subjectivity and objectivity. You can sort of take it as a sort of maxim from Husserl that one of the great dangers of science is that it has tried since the early Galileo and so on to remove the subjective experience from our analysis of the world and to describe the world only in terms of its so-called objective properties. So Husserl talks about this as objectivism, and he connects it also to what he calls naturalism and materialism. And he thinks that what this has done is methodologically excluded, for perfectly good reasons, our subjective experiences. But ultimately, if any full and complete science has to relocate objectivity within our experience and within subjectivity. So in one sense, phenomenology then is the science of subjectivity. Husserl says that, and Husserl starts to use this word, the life of consciousness, Bewusstseinsleben, that the target of phenomenology is to understand how the life of consciousness is put together. Individual consciousness, social consciousness, communal, historical consciousness, all of these forms of consciousness. And there, Husserl, was not alone. Also around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, you have William James writing about consciousness, and you have Bergson writing about consciousness. And Husserl is the third major figure. You can say Freud is writing about the unconscious, das Unbewusste, what's not conscious. But Husserl wants to focus primarily on how is consciousness a player in our experience? What is it that consciousness brings to our understanding of knowledge and so on? And so one of the things that phenomenology does is to act as a constant reminder that you cannot have a purely objectivist description of anything because subjectivity is always involved. Now, of course, Husserl thought, well, like Heidegger, he thought, well, of course, our subjective entanglement in knowledge is obviously, as everyone will acknowledge these days, full of what now the term is implicit bias. But of course it's biased because you see things from your point of view. I mean, that's kind of self-evident, but Husserl is saying, let's understand what point of view involves here. And, Heidegger's hermeneutical phenomenology is really an extension of this idea that we have to understand how it is that we interpret our own experiences. So Husserl recognizes that our original experience, as he calls it in the natural attitude, is already biased, and it's actually quite biased towards objectivism, because we just look out the window and I think those birds and trees are just there. I don't have any kind of doubts about that. But when I reflect on it and realize that all my experience is constituted by my synthesis of my senses and my memory, but also my linguistic categorizations and my location in space and my embodiment. I'm seeing with two eyes and so on. My hearing can only hear a certain range. We have to realize that we as human beings are filtering the world. So Husserl's phenomenology is how to describe that without being caught in the biases of that very filtering process. And that's what leads him to this idea of the phenomenological reduction or the bracketing as a way of trying to constantly disrupt the flow of our natural experience. And that's what Husserl calls the transcendental attitude. So what happens is, initially, and a lot of Husserl's students stayed with this, they did what's called realistic phenomenology or descriptive phenomenology. And phenomenology was meant to put aside hypotheses. It was meant to put aside speculative theories and just describe what Husserl calls the things themselves, get back to the matters themselves. And those matters are the way our own experiences are felt and experienced. By the way, there's something similar in Freud. Again, I mean, Freud wants us to look at our dreams, and to understand how they're constituted and what significance they have for us. So it wouldn't be a good answer if you were talking to a Freudian and I said, I had a dream last night, but that was because I ate cheese very late at night, or something like that. So that would be a causal explanation. The reason you had that was because you took 3 glasses of wine before you went to bed. So that is indeed a causal, physiological, psychological explanation in the naturalistic mode. And a lot of our experience can be described like that, but that's not what the Husserl and Freud are looking for. They're looking for how it is that we understand these experiences in terms of their meaning or sense. So Freudian and Husserlian accounts of our experience both want to focus on how do they make sense to us. So trying to understand how things make sense. That's how I see phenomenology. Phenomenology is making sense. And to make sense of things, you've got to put aside various theories you've heard or whatever, and try to just get to the foundational features of your experience. So in that regard, it's not enough just to do careful description like one finds in literature of our emotional or, intellectual or sensory experiences. Husserl is a scientist. He wants to get to the root of it, so he wants to get to what he calls the essence of our experiences. So what's the essence of perception? I mean, in the sense of some people want to say, oh, perception is really a mixture of imagining and remembering, and it's all kind of plugged together. Well, that's fine, but if perceiving and remembering and imagining are all sort of melded together, they still must have separate elements, that we can identify. Otherwise, we just won't be able to distinguish one from the other. And yet we do. I can say, remember what you had for breakfast this morning. You don't have to go around and say, oh, let me see, what button do I have to press to get memories going? I have direct access. So this is really a crucial point of consciousness. I have a first person, immediate direct access to my own conscious experience. So Husserl thinks I can use that methodically and by carefully to examine it. So, for example, if I want to understand how I structure time consciousness, I can look at that and realize, how I constitute the now and how I am always constituting what is just past as the past. And I'm always protending, as Husserl says, towards the future. I'm waiting to hear what's the end of this sentence. We're all doing that all the time. So we can start to observe that. So Husserl's phenomenology then involves a certain degree of training to understand how we experience our own conscious and cognitive processes. And he has various amounts of bracketing and shadings. But what he wants to get at is some sort of essential laws, what he calls then a priori universal laws that govern consciousness as such, right? So that's really the whole project of phenomenology. But since that includes so many other things, I mean, although he starts with Descartes, Husserl quickly realizes, well, wait a second, our consciousness is embodied, and embodiment is a really crucial feature of our experience. And our embodiment is multimodal, it's a visual, oral, but also sensory. And Husserl has a great deal to say about what he calls the living body, Leib, as opposed to the physical body, and we're both. Like, I give the example to my students, when you fall down the stairs, your body is a purely physical object following gravity. But when you jump in the air, you're controlling your body and indeed fighting against gravity. And we go through both. Our bodies are both objects in the world, physical entities in the world, obeying the laws of nature, but they're also, as Husserl will say, they're belonging to the world of spirit, as he calls it. And so they're following what he calls the laws of motivation rather than causation. That means, I want to reach the top shelf, so I jump up. So, and the whole basis of our conscious lives, and this is a word I haven't even used yet, but everyone assumes that it's central to phenomenology, is this idea of intentionality. So intentionality is the basic idea that all our experiences are sort of meaning constituting. They're directed at objects which we understand in particular ways. And Husserl thinks this intentionality is the key to unlock the mystery of consciousness, like that.
It's interesting. As you were relating all of this, what phenomenology is, the method, the philosophical enterprise through Husserl and his. I was just thinking of what a fantastic lecturer you are, and I have an inside little story to tell you. When I posted your picture next to Husserl on social media, many of your students messaged me and said he's a fantastic lecturer, he's a brilliant lecturer, you'll have an absolute fantastic time. And so as I'm listening to your answers, I'm being drawn in so nicely. And so I wanted to also
That's
share
very
that.
nice of you to say that, but I have to contrast that with Husserl, who was a notoriously dry and boring lecturer. And Gadamer describes him that he reminded him of a watchmaker gone mad, is how Gadamer described it. Because Husserl used to have a phrase to his students, no big bills, only small change. And he would say that he always wanted to get down to the little details, not the big, cosmic view of things, but exactly how does perception work? When we see the front side of these books, I know there's another side that I don't see. Now, do I imagine that other side, or is it given in some kind of part of my perception? And Husserl says, well, I can imagine what's on the other side, but in fact, there's a kind of empty intending where I just know it has another side, but I don't know what color it is, for example. Like I look at the top of the table, I know it has to have an underside, but I don't know if it's the same color as the top side of the table. So this kind of empty intending. So Husserl is always trying to find the different parts that belong to our experience. But as a result, he was a very rather dry lecturer, at least according to his students. Yeah. But to be fair, one of the problems with Husserl, he was known for rarely giving examples. And I like to give examples because I think people can grasp them and understand things that way. So Husserl, the famous story about Husserl, where he was having a conversation with a student, and the student said, well, can you give me an example? And Husserl says, yes, I will. Consider any object in general. So that was, it's very mathematical. Consider any shape whatsoever, that kind of idea. So that's not quite an example in the sense that we want to normally to have examples. But anyway, that's some insights into Husserl's teaching method. But by the way, he was very popular with his students, and he did gather large numbers of students to follow him to Freiburg to do phenomenology in the setting there, which was a setting of Southwest Neo-Kantianism. So when Husserl went to Freiburg, he was at his most Kantian, and he was invited to talk to the Kant Society in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. We just had the 300th anniversary of Kant's birth, and Husserl spoke at the 200th anniversary of Kant's birth. So, and his essays are on the relationship between Kant and phenomenology and the transcendental move, which is really meant to look at the conditions of the possibility of our experiencing, but not to assume, as Kant did, that those conditions somehow match the Copernican Newtonian world. So yes, our experience is conditioned by time and space and causation, but they're not the Newtonian space or the Newtonian flowing time or the Newtonian concept of causation. Rather, we're embodied creatures living in the life world, and that became a big point in Husserl's late phenomenology.
What is Husserl? I mean, we had spoken of psychology and psychologism. So what is Husserl's critique of psychologism, and how do you think, and how does this phenomenology relate to this critique?
Well, there's several stages, and one could say that Husserl all his life was trying to extract himself from a certain, he uses the phrase naturalization of consciousness. He thinks the big mistake of modern philosophy, especially Locke and Hume, is that they had naturalized consciousness, and they had treated consciousness, and he said even Descartes was responsible for this, for treating consciousness as a little Enden der Welt. That means a little butt end of the world. Like when Descartes does his cogito ergo sum, he discovers something that you cannot doubt and that has existence, even if I deny it exists. But then what Descartes does is he uses that little bit of the world to rebuild the world. And Husserl says what he should have done, he says he opened the door to transcendental subjectivity, but he should have explored it instead of going back out and naturalizing it and just treating it as a building block in the world. You understand what, like Husserl's criticism of Descartes was that Husserl says the cogito, oh, what's the cogito? Ah, it's me, but it's also the first true thing. And also it's a criterion for truth. So it's like a little ruler. I can measure if anything is true by using the cogito. So then I'm testing each of my ideas. So suddenly I'm out there, back in the world again. Whereas Husserl says, when you discover the transcendental subjectivity, you've got to look at how it's constituted and how it is also constituting everything else. And Husserl thinks that somehow the ego constitutes itself, by these operations of synthesis out of the flow of time consciousness. And eventually he came to the sort of a genetic account of that and a constitutive account of that. Clearly, Merleau-Ponty develops this. We are who we are because of our childhood, and as Merleau-Ponty took over the chair that Piaget held, and children have a different concept of causation than adults. And indeed these days there's people study what's called folk physics. Not just physics, but to understand how people think things work. Because like if you throw something, we all know it'll go a certain distance and fall down again. That's not Newtonian. If you throw something, it should go always in the same direction, unless it's impeded by another force. But in the life world, things are different. So we have a way of navigating in the life world. Nobody walks in a straight line, for example, and you'll see that in pathways. People walk in ways that to avoid, wet bits and slippy bits and rocks. And so we navigate like a sheep path around things. So, you have to understand that our whole experience, as it's embedded in the world, is done through our embodiment, and that's something that Husserl thinks very differently from Kant, that Kant had ignored that side of things. He thought that there was, if you like, space-time causation, unity, the categories, but they were sort of neutral. They weren't really the embodied ones that we have, right? So moving between childhood, adulthood, and so on, there are different ways in which our bodies experience the world. So that has to be accounted for. And also that there's a unity of consciousness through the whole thing, oddly. And Husserl ends up saying, even in the Cartesian meditations, he says the ego constitutes itself in the unity of a history. In other words, an autobiography, if you like. So one of the things I always think, and I use this example, that the ego for Husserl is like a snowball, that as it moves through life, it accumulates. Nothing is lost. You can think you've forgotten it or whatever, but if you break your arm, the arm has niggles in it, that remind you that it was once broken. There's no, you can cancel it. You can say, oh, I don't care about that, but it's still there. And that's the ego. For Husserl, you can forget it, but it's still niggling at you somehow. That's your memories can be erased, but they're there. That's the sort of Husserlian point about consciousness.
Well, so I don't want to take too much of your time, so I just have one more question. You've brought up the life world multiple times.
Yeah.
Maybe we can kind of end our discussion on Husserl on what is the life world.
Yes, you see, Husserl, as I said, started with a science of sciences and tried to get phenomenology as an underlying science of all our experience. And he began by a retreat to subjectivity, in the Cartesian way. He even calls it the Cartesian way into phenomenology. Um, and then, issues like how do we relate to other subjects comes up. And Descartes always says, oh, I don't know if the other person is just a machine or some kind of coat and hat, that doesn't have an internal cogito. I only know I have a cogito. But Husserl thought, no, I constitute the other person as another subject, and that's I do through empathy. And then I encounter them in the context of a whole cultural intersubjective community. against what he says is the backdrop of the life world. So the life world, I mean, there are many. Gadamer thinks that life world is Husserl's biggest contribution to phenomenology, and there's no doubt that it influenced phenomenological psychology of Schutz, for example, Alfred Schutz, and later on Berger and Luckmann took the idea of life world in their, in their books about the constitution of the social world. And Habermas makes a great deal of use of the life world, which he probably influenced through Schutz, but indirectly from Husserl. The term was in existence before Husserl, but certainly Husserl is the one who talks most about Lebenswelt or Lebensumwelt, the life world or the life environment. And it's a very complex idea. It's not a simple idea. It's not just my social milieu. It's not just my organic biosphere. It's almost all of these things together. So, you know, when I'm speaking to you now, we're using the English language. I didn't make up any of these words. They're all, common English words. So they were all spoken by other people. And yet somehow I can reproduce the meanings of others in my own voice. And that means I'm already somehow in an intersubjective milieu, which is the world of linguistic or language. But I don't know how to describe that, because that's, I'm drawing on it. I'm drawing on this background of my knowledge of language and hoping that you're in the same one. But I'm always constituting us as sharing this Sprachgemeinschaft, as Husserl calls it, this linguistic community. But all of these communities, my social community, my community of contexts, are always backdrop of the life world. So for Husserl, the life world is this ever-receding horizon at the back of all our social communicative encounters. So for that reason, it's kind of mysterious notion. But he thinks that if you leave it out of discussion, you won't be able to understand human activity, history, and so on. We are who we are in relationship to our life worlds, some of which overlap. Like Gadamer has this idea of fusion of horizons. The aim of understanding is to arrive at a fusion of horizons. But Heidegger and Husserl both put a great deal of emphasis on how our experience is, broadly speaking, horizontal. We're never just here in this moment. We're, reaching into the forward, but also drawing on our educational experience, on our habits, on our life formation, all of that. And all of that is there somehow constituting our experience. So I think that's like Husserl's central idea is to understand, especially cultural concepts, we have to understand it from out of the life world. He says that, and that one of the problems of modern science, it kind of cut the connection between the world of science, the world of physics, world of medicine, and the life world. And so we have to somehow he says that's fine methodologically when you want to focus on something in particular, but in the broader scheme of things, you have to somehow reintegrate these sciences back into the life world.
Fantastic answer, and very rich, and a great way to end our discussion on Husserl. But just before we leave, I wanted to highlight some of your work. So you have this brilliant text, Edmund Husserl, founder of Phenomenology in 2005. Could you maybe bring up some of the text for the viewers to see, actually?
Oh, okay. Yes, yeah. Well, that's my 2005 book, Edmund Husserl, founder of Phenomenology. And then I did a big book on Husserl's Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, which was a commentary on Husserl's last work on the Crisis of the European Sciences. And I did this with Joseph Cohen, the Husserl Dictionary, which takes all of Husserl's central concepts and gives them a kind of an explanation, but also anchors them in his main text. And of course, I did some edited works like the shorter logical investigations, which is an edition of Husserl's logical investigation, which is too big. Anyway, even the shorter version is something like 400 pages long.
So thank you so much for being here with me and being a part of this series, Dr. Moran. You did such a fantastic job of really navigating us through who Husserl is, what phenomenology is as a method, and I think this is a great access to really grasp
Yeah,
Husserl's project.
I think can I just end by saying that even though phenomenology as a movement is really a 20th century movement and probably lost a lot of ground in, for example, the movements from structuralism to post-structuralism, deconstruction, and so on. Nevertheless, phenomenology continues, and it's a really important strain in phenomenological psychology. But these days, it's also hugely important in the health sciences. And indeed, a lot of medics are very interested in pathology, and phenomenology is a way of understanding patient experience in all kinds of physical and psychosocial and psychological illnesses. So phenomenology is very richly involved in a lot of the health sciences, medicine, and in the qualitative side of sociology and psychology and so on to this day. Okay.
That's a great way to end. And once again, thank you so much for giving us such a fantastic episode.
Thank you, Chris. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
And thank you.